There's nothing more heartbreaking than a child left alone in this world. Every parent's worst nightmare is losing sight of their little one, even for a moment. In the winter of 1870s New Mexico, an aging Apache scout named Joseph finds a small girl half dead in the snow. She can't speak his language, and no one in town will claim her. Joseph lost his own daughter years ago, so he takes the girl in. But as he searches for her family, he discovers someone wanted her dead. The town is hiding secrets, and Joseph must find the truth while protecting this child who reminds him of everything he's lost. He's been cast out by this community before, but now he has to go back to save her. What will he find when he digs into the past that everyone wants to keep buried? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind carried more than snow through the pines that morning. It carried the weight of memory, the kind that settles in a man's bones and refuses to leave. Joseph Crowfeather pulled his worn coat tighter as he studied the small tracks in the fresh powder, his weathered hands steady despite the cold that would have sent younger men running for shelter. At 62, Joseph had learned to read stories in the snow the way other men read newspapers. These tracks told a tale that made his chest tighten with recognition. Small feet, unsteady gait, the desperate weaving pattern of someone lost and afraid. But it was the size that stopped his breath. No bigger than his own daughters had been. All those years ago, the cabin he called home sat nestled against a stand of ancient ponderosa pines, 3 miles from the settlement of Cedar Ridge. It wasn't much to look at rough-hewn logs chinked with mud and moss, a stone chimney that drew smoke straight up into the mountain air, windows made from real glass that had cost him a month's wages from his last scouting job. But it was his, bought with blood money from the army and maintained by a stubborn refusal to let the wilderness claim it back. Most folks in Cedar Ridge knew Joseph by reputation rather than friendship. He'd served as a scout during the Apache conflicts, walking the dangerous line between two worlds that never quite accepted him as their own. His Apache mother had named him Nalnish, which meant he works, but the army had insisted on Joseph, and the name had stuck like bark to a tree. Now he was neither fully Apache nor fully accepted by the white settlements, existing in that gray space reserved for men who'd made choices that pleased no one completely. The war medal tucked away in his cedar chest told only part of his story. It spoke of distinguished service, of dangerous missions behind enemy lines, of a man who could track Apache raiders through terrain that would swallow whole cavalry units. What it didn't mention was the price of that service, the trust he'd broken, the people he'd led into ambush, the daughter he'd lost because he'd been too busy serving two masters to protect the one person who mattered most. His daughter, Maya, had been 7 when the raiders came. She'd been picking berries near their old camp while he was away, guiding a patrol that would ultimately save a dozen settler families. By the time he returned, there was nothing left but burned wickiups, and the kind of silence that echoes in a man's chest for the rest of his life. The metal felt heavier than lead every time he touched it. Now, following these new tracks through knee-deep snow, Joseph felt the familiar weight pressing against his ribs. The trail led down toward the main road, weaving between trees with the uncertain steps of someone very young and very scared. Whoever had made these prints was running from something, and in this country, that usually meant trouble of the worst kind. He found her collapsed against a fallen log, barely visible, under a coating of snow that had settled on her small form like a burial shroud. At first, he thought she might be dead, the blue tinge to her lips, the way her small chest barely rose and fell, the stillness that reminded him too much of other children he'd found too late. But when he knelt beside her, those dark eyes fluttered, open wide with terror and confusion. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old, with long dark hair matted with ice and clothes that had once been fine but were now torn and soaked through. Her dress was wool, good quality, the kind worn by merchant families or well-to-do ranchers, not the rough cotton and leather typical of frontier children. Someone with money had dressed this child, and someone with different intentions had left. Her to die in the wilderness. Joseph had seen enough of death to recognize its approach. Hypothermia was claiming her by degrees, stealing warmth and consciousness with each passing minute. Without immediate care, she would be gone before the sun reached its peak. He gathered her into his coat, surprised by how light she felt, how fragile life could be when stripped down to its essential elements. "Easy, little one," he murmured in Apache, then switched to English. "You're safe now. I'm going to help you." She tried to speak, lips moving soundlessly, eyes darting around as if searching for escape routes or hidden dangers. When he lifted her, she went rigid with fear, a response that told him volumes about what she'd experienced before ending up alone in the snow. Children didn't develop that kind of wariness without reason. The trek back to his cabin tested every skill he'd learned about field medicine and survival. He kept her conscious by talking continuously, switching between Apache and English, sharing stories about the mountains and the animals that lived there. She listened but didn't respond, those dark eyes tracking his face with an intelligence that suggested she understood more than she was letting on. Inside the cabin, Joseph worked with the methodical precision of someone who treated battlefield injuries and frontier accidents. He started a fire in the stone hearth, heated water, and began the careful process of warming her core temperature without shocking her system. Her clothes were ruin-torn, frozen, stained with what looked like dried blood around the hem of her dress. He replaced them with one of his flannel shirts, which hung on her like a tent but provided the warmth she desperately needed. As color returned to her cheeks and her breathing steadied, Joseph studied her face for clues about her identity. She had the refined features of someone raised with care and education, not the weathered look of children born to hard-scrabble frontier life. Her hands were soft, unmarked by the calluses that came from daily chores and outdoor work. This was a child from a comfortable family, which made her presence in the wilderness even more troubling. When she finally spoke, it was barely a whisper. Cold. So cold. "I know," Joseph replied, adjusting the blanket around her shoulders. "But you're warming up now. You're going to be fine." She studied his face with those intelligent eyes, taking in his weathered features, the gray streaking his black hair, the scars that mapped a lifetime of hard choices. "Are you Indian?" she asked, the question carrying no judgment, only curiosity. "Half," Joseph answered honestly. "My mother was Apache. My father was a buffalo soldier. That makes me something in between. My papa said Indians were good at finding lost things." The simple statement hit him harder than it should have. "What's your name, child?" She hesitated, fear flickering across her features. I'm not supposed to tell." "Not supposed to tell who?" "Anyone. Papa said never tell strangers my real name." Joseph nodded, recognizing the wisdom in that instruction, while wondering what circumstances had made it necessary. "Well then, what should I call you?" She thought for a long moment. "You can call me Little Bird. That's what Mama used to call me." The past tense didn't escape his notice. "Where are your parents, Little Bird?" The fear returned to her eyes, along with something that looked like grief. "They went away. Uncle Robert said they had to go far away and couldn't take me. And where's Uncle Robert now?" She pulled the blanket tighter around herself. "He said he was taking me somewhere safe. But then we stopped, and he told me to wait by the trees. He said he'd be right back." Her voice dropped to barely audible. "That was yesterday, I think. Maybe longer." I got cold waiting. Joseph felt anger building in his chest, the slow burn of rage that came when men failed to protect children. Uncle Worth, the name would leave a child alone in winter wilderness. especially not a child dressed for town rather than survival. Someone had abandoned her deliberately, and that someone had expected her to die. "Well, little bird," he said, keeping his voice gentle despite the fury coursing through him, "Uncle Robert isn't coming back. But you don't need to worry about that now. You're safe here with me, and I'm not going anywhere." She studied his face. Again, perhaps sensing something in his tone that convinced her of his sincerity. "Will you take me home?" "I don't know where home is yet," Joseph admitted. "But I promise you this, I'll find out, and I'll make sure you get where you belong." It was a promise that would prove more complicated than either of them could imagine. As Joseph prepared a simple meal of venison stew and cornbread, he found himself remembering his daughter's laughter. The way Maya used to help him prepare food by standing on a wooden stool to reach the counter. This child moved with the same careful precision, accepting his help, but maintaining a dignity that reminded him painfully of everything he'd lost. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering the tracks that had led him to her and erasing evidence of whatever had happened before their paths crossed. In the morning, he would take her to Cedar Ridge, find the doctor, ask questions that needed answers. But for tonight, in the warm glow of firelight, Joseph allowed himself to pretend that maybe, just maybe, he'd been given a chance to save someone who mattered. The child who called herself Little Bird fell asleep in the chair beside the fire, wrapped in blankets that smelled of wood smoke and sage. Joseph watched over her through the night, listening to her breathing, ready to respond if nightmares came calling. In her sleeping face, he saw echoes of his own daughter, and for the first time in 20 years, he felt something that might have been hope stirring in the cold corners of his heart. Morning brought clarity in more ways than one. Little Bird woke with better color in her cheeks and an appetite that reassured Joseph she was past the immediate danger of hypothermia. But it also brought the harsh reality of decisions that couldn't be postponed. A child needed more care than an isolated man could provide, and questions about her identity demanded answers that only the town might supply. Joseph hitched his horse to the small wagon he used for supply runs, creating a nest of blankets in the back where Little Bird could ride comfortably. She'd grown quiet since waking, watching him with those intelligent eyes that seemed to catalog every detail of their surroundings. When he helped her into the wagon, she clutched a small piece of torn fabric she'd produced from somewhere in her dress, expensive silk and deep blue. Nothing like the rough materials common to frontier clothing. The ride to Cedar Ridge took the better part of an hour through snow-covered trails that wound between stands of pine and aspen. Joseph had made this journey countless times over the past 5 years, usually for supplies or the occasional job that required his tracking skills. But today felt different, weighted with possibility and dread in equal measure. Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at, a collection of weathered buildings clustered around a main street that turned to mud whenever it wasn't frozen solid. The town boasted a general store, a saloon, a church, a doctor's office, and enough houses to support maybe 300 souls who were either too stubborn or too poor to move somewhere more hospitable. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business, which made the mystery of Little Bird even more troubling. Joseph pulled up in front of Doc Peterson's office, a narrow building squeezed between the barbershop and the dry goods store. Peterson had been the town's only doctor for 15 years, a competent man who'd learned his trade during the war and settled in Cedar Ridge because it was quiet and asked few questions about a man's past. He was also one of the few people in town who treated Joseph with something approaching respect. The bell above the door chimed as they entered, and Peterson looked up from his desk where he'd been writing in a leather-bound ledger. He was a thin man with prematurely gray hair and hands that remained steady despite his fondness for whiskey, which made him valuable in a place where steady hands could mean the difference between life and death. "Joseph," Peterson nodded. Then his eyes found Little Bird. "And who might this young lady be?" "That's what I'm hoping you can help me figure out, Doc." Joseph guided Little Bird to one of the chairs beside Peterson's examining table. Found her near frozen to death up on the mountain trail yesterday. Peterson's expression grew serious as he knelt to Little Bird's level. Well now, let's have a look at you, sweetheart. Can you tell me your name? Little Bird shrank back against the chair, her eyes darting between the doctor and Joseph. I'm not supposed to tell strangers my name, she whispered. She's been through something bad, Joseph explained quietly. Says her uncle left her waiting by some trees and never came back. The doctor's examination was gentle but thorough. He checked her temperature, listened to her breathing, looked at her hands and feet for signs of frostbite. As he worked, he asked careful questions about how she felt, whether anything hurt, if she remembered anything about how she'd ended up alone. Little Bird answered in whispers, never taking her eyes off Joseph as if he were her anchor in uncertain waters. Physically, she's going to be fine, Peterson announced after completing his examination. A little dehydrated, some minor exposure damage, but nothing that rest and good food won't cure. He paused, studying Little Bird's face with professional interest. But that's not what's troubling about this situation. What do you mean, Doc? Peterson gestured toward Little Bird's dress, which they'd brought along in a bundle. This fabric. The cut of the dress, this is expensive clothing. Custom made, I'd say. Probably ordered from back east. The child's been well cared for, well fed, educated. Look at her hands soft as butter. She's never done a day's hard work in her life. Joseph had noticed the same details, but hearing them confirmed made the situation feel more ominous. So we're looking for a wealthy family that's lost a daughter. That's just it, Peterson said, lowering his voice. I've been the only doctor in this area for 15 years. I know every family with children, know their medical histories, their circumstances. There's no one in Cedar Ridge or any of the surrounding settlements who's missing a girl matching this description. The implications settled over them like a heavy blanket. If no local family was missing her, then she'd come from somewhere else. But Cedar Ridge was isolated, connected to the outside world by rough trails that would be nearly impassable in winter. For a child to end up here, someone would have had to bring her deliberately. Maybe her family was just passing through, Joseph suggested. Though he didn't believe it himself, Peterson shook his head. Look at her, Joseph. This child hasn't been traveling rough. Her skin's too soft, her hair too well tended. She was living in comfort until very recently. He paused, choosing his words carefully. And there's something else. See this bruising on her wrists? Fresh, maybe 2 days old. Someone grabbed her hard enough to leave marks. The anger that had been simmering in Joseph's chest flared into something hotter. Someone had hurt this child, frightened her, abandoned her to die. The kind of person who would do such things didn't deserve the mercy that civilization demanded. We need to ask around town, Joseph said. Someone must have seen something, strangers arriving, families leaving suddenly, anything out of the ordinary. Agreed. But Joseph, Peterson's voice carried a warning. Be careful how you go about this. If someone wanted this child dead, they're not going to appreciate you asking questions. They left Little Bird with Peterson's wife Martha while they made their initial inquiries. The general store, the saloon, the church, each stop yielded the same response. Blank stares, shaking heads, genuine puzzlement about the mysterious child. Nobody remembered seeing strangers in town. Nobody knew of missing children. Nobody could explain how a well-dressed girl had ended up half-frozen in the wilderness. It was at the sheriff's office that they encountered the first crack in the wall of ignorance. Sheriff Donovan was a large man with the kind of belly that spoke to two. Many years behind a desk, and not enough chasing actual criminals. He'd held the job for 8 years through a combination of political connections and willingness to look the other way when it served the interests of Cedar Ridge's more prominent citizens. When Joseph described finding Little Bird, Donovan's reaction was subtly wrong, too quick to dismiss, too eager to suggest the child be sent to the territorial orphanage. "Look, Joseph," Donovan said, leaning back in his chair with forced casualness, "I appreciate you doing your civic duty and all, but this sounds like someone else's problem. Child probably wandered off from a wagon train, got separated somehow. These things happen. In winter? With no wagon train reported missing anyone?" Donovan shrugged. "Territory's a big place. Could have happened anywhere, and she just wandered. Until you found her. Best thing is to get her to the orphanage in Santa Fe. They'll know how to handle this sort of situation." Something in the sheriff's tone set off warning bells in Joseph's mind. The man was trying too hard to close the conversation, too willing to ship a child off to an uncertain fate rather than investigate properly. Either Donovan was lazy, or he knew more than he was admitting. "Sheriff," Joseph said carefully, "you certain there haven't been any strangers in town recently? Any families that might have left suddenly?" "I'm certain," Donovan replied, but his eyes didn't meet Joseph's. "And I'd advise you to drop this matter. Sometimes it's better not to ask too many questions about things that don't concern you." The warning was unmistakable, and it confirmed Joseph's growing suspicion that Little Bird's abandonment wasn't random. Someone in Cedar Ridge knew exactly who she was and why she'd been left to die. The question was whether that someone was trying to cover their tracks or protect themselves from consequences. Walking back to the doctor's office, Joseph felt the familiar weight of difficult choices settling on his shoulders. He could follow the sheriff's advice, take Little Bird to the orphanage, and walk away from whatever dangerous knowledge she represented. It would be the safe choice, the smart choice for a man who'd already lost too much to other people's wars. But when he saw her sitting in Martha Peterson's kitchen, carefully eating soup with the precise manners of someone taught proper etiquette, he knew walking away wasn't an option. This child needed protection, and she needed answers about what had happened to her family. If the people of Cedar Ridge wanted to keep their secrets, they were going to have to deal with a man who'd spent 30 years learning how to uncover truths that others preferred to keep buried. The torn piece of expensive fabric in Little Bird's small hand told its own story. Someone had ripped her from a life of comfort and safety, brought her to this isolated place, and abandoned her to the mercy of winter and wilderness. That someone had made a mistake, though they'd underestimated both the child's will to survive and the determination of the man who'd found her. Joseph Crowfeather had failed to protect his own daughter 20 years ago. He wouldn't make that mistake twice. The next 3 days fell into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Joseph. He'd lived alone for so long that the sound of another person moving through his cabin seemed to echo off the walls in strange ways. Little Bird was a quiet child, polite to the point of formality, but she watched everything with those sharp eyes that missed nothing. She helped with simple tasks, setting the table with careful precision, organizing his scattered books into neat piles, folding blankets, with the kind of attention to detail that spoke of rigid training. Whoever had raised her had insisted on proper behavior, and she maintained those standards even in the rough surroundings of a bachelor's mountain cabin. It was while she was helping him prepare breakfast on the 4th morning that she produced the silver locket. Joseph was slicing bacon when he noticed her fumbling with something inside the lining of her dress, the one garment they'd managed to save from her ordeal. Her small fingers worked at a careful seam, and after several minutes of patient effort, she extracted a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. "I wasn't supposed to show this to anyone," she said quietly, holding it out for him to see. "But Mama said if something bad happened, I should keep it safe and only show it to someone I trusted." The locket was beautifully crafted, the kind of jewelry that cost more than most frontier families saw in a year. When Joseph opened it with gentle fingers, he found a small photograph of a woman with Little Bird's eyes and delicate features. The woman was well-dressed, posed in the formal manner of studio portraits, with an inscription on the inside of the locket that read, "From my darling Anna, with all my love, Mother." "Anna," Joseph said softly, testing the name. "That's your real name, isn't it?" She nodded, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "Anna Catherine. But I wasn't supposed to tell anyone, not even you. Papa said there were bad men who might hurt me if they knew who I was." Joseph studied the photograph more carefully. The woman's dress suggested wealth and social position, and the photographer's mark in the corner indicated the picture had been taken in Denver, nearly 200 miles from Cedar Ridge. This wasn't a local family. These were people of means from a major city, which made Anna's presence in the wilderness even more troubling. "Anna," he said, choosing his words carefully, "can you tell me what happened to your mother and father? Take your time, and only tell me what you remember." She sat silent for a long moment, staring at the locket in her small hands. When she spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "There were men at our house, late at night. They were angry about something Papa had done, something about papers and land. Mama hid me in the root cellar and told me not to come out no matter what I heard." Joseph felt his chest tighten as the story continued. "I heard shouting, and then guns. When everything got quiet, Uncle Robert came and found me. He said Mama and Papa had to go away for a while, and he was going to take me somewhere safe until they could come back." "But your uncle didn't take you somewhere safe, did he?" Anna shook her head, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "He was nice at first. We rode in a wagon for days, and he bought me food and told me stories. But then he started acting strange, talking to himself, drinking from a bottle that made him smell funny. And then that last day, when he told me to wait by the trees." She couldn't finish the sentence. Joseph reached across the table and covered her small hand with his larger, scarred one. "Anna, I think your uncle wasn't really trying to keep you safe. I think maybe he was paid to take you away from your home. But why would anyone pay to hurt me? I'm just a little girl." The question cut straight to Joseph's heart. In his years as a scout, he'd seen enough of human evil to understand that children often paid the price for their parents' actions. But explaining such cruelty to an 8-year-old seemed impossible. Instead, he focused on what she needed to hear. "Some men do bad things for money," he said simply. "But that's not your fault, and it doesn't change what's important now. You're safe here with me, and I'm going to find out what happened to your parents." Over the following days, Joseph began his careful investigation while Anna helped with simple tasks around the cabin. He started by visiting the businesses in Cedar Ridge, ostensibly shopping for supplies, but actually asking subtle questions. About the expensive fabric from Anna's dress. At the dry goods store, he learned that such fine wool hadn't been ordered by anyone in town, which meant it had come from outside the area. The blacksmith remembered shoeing horses for a wagon that had passed through about a week earlier, traveling fast and stopping only for necessary repairs. The description matched what Anna had told him about traveling with her uncle, a single man driving hard, acting nervous, paying in cash, and moving on quickly. It was at the saloon that Joseph found his first real lead. The bartender, a weathered man named Collins, who'd been pouring drinks in Cedar Ridge longer than anyone could remember, pulled Joseph aside after serving him coffee. "Heard you're asking about strangers passing through," Collins said quietly, wiping down glasses with mechanical precision. "There was a fellow about 10 days ago. Well-dressed city type, but nervous as a long-tailed cat in a room full of rocking chairs. Kept looking over his shoulder, drinking too much, asking about trails heading south toward Mexico. Traveling alone? Had a child with him. Pretty little girl, well-mannered. Bought her candy and tried to keep her happy, but you could tell something wasn't right. The girl looked scared, and the man looked guilty." Collins paused, studying Joseph's face. That wouldn't happen to be the child you found up on the mountain, would it? Joseph nodded. Did this man say anything about why he was traveling? Where he was headed? Not much. But I'll tell you what struck me as odd. He had money, good money, but he was asking about the cheapest routes out of the territory. Most folks with that kind of cash aren't worried about saving a few dollars on travel expenses. Made me think he was in a hurry to disappear. The pieces were starting to form a picture that Joseph didn't like. A nervous man with money, traveling fast with a frightened child, asking about escape routes to Mexico. It sounded like someone fulfilling an unpleasant contract, getting paid to remove a problem and then planning to vanish across the border, where questions wouldn't follow. But something had gone wrong. Instead of completing whatever arrangement he'd made, the man had abandoned Anna in the wilderness. Either his conscience had rebelled at the last moment, or he'd decided that letting her die of exposure was preferable to whatever more direct action he'd been hired to perform. That evening, as Joseph prepared dinner while Anna sat by the fire practicing her letters in a notebook he'd found for her, he made a decision that would change both their lives. Tomorrow, he would ride to the county seat and send telegrams to law enforcement in Denver. If Anna's parents had been murdered as she suspected, there would be records, investigations, people looking for answers. But he would also take precautions. If someone had been willing to pay to have a child killed, they wouldn't appreciate learning that their plan had failed. Joseph had survived 30 years on the frontier by being prepared for trouble, and he had no intention of letting harm come to Anna while she was under his protection. As she worked on her letters with the concentrated effort of someone who took education seriously, Joseph found himself remembering his daughter Maya at the same age. The careful way she held a pencil, the tip of her tongue showing at the corner of her mouth when she concentrated, the pride she took in forming each letter correctly. Anna had the same dedication to learning, the same quiet intelligence that made teaching a joy rather than a chore. For the first time in 20 years, Joseph allowed himself to hope that maybe he'd been given a second chance to protect someone who mattered. The nightmares started on Anna's 6th night in the cabin. Joseph woke to the sound of muffled crying from the small alcove where he'd made her a bed, separated from the main room by a curtain he'd hung for privacy. When he pulled the fabric aside, he found her sitting up in the narrow bunk, clutching the blood-stained handkerchief she'd kept hidden in her boot until that morning. The handkerchief was fine linen, embroidered with the initials R.H. in elegant script. Anna had produced it reluctantly when Joseph asked if she had anything else that might help identify her family, and the dried blood on the fabric told its own grim story. She'd been carrying a piece of evidence without understanding its significance. "The bad men," Anna whispered when she saw Joseph. "They're in my dreams. They keep coming back." Joseph sat on the edge of her bed, keeping his voice gentle. "Dreams can't hurt you, Anna. You're safe here with me. But what if they find me? What if they come here?" The fear in her voice was real and immediate, and Joseph realized that his own nightmares had been returning as well. For 20 years, he'd been haunted by dreams of his daughter Maya, always just out of reach, always calling for help that never came. Now, with Anna sleeping under his roof, those old dreams had merged with new fears about failing to protect another child who needed him. "Tell me about these bad men," Joseph said. "What do you remember about them?" Anna gripped the handkerchief tighter. "One of them was really big, with a beard and mean eyes. He kept yelling at Papa about papers, about land that didn't belong to us. The other one was smaller, but he was the one who scared me most. He had a scar right here." She touched her own cheek. "And when he looked at me, it felt like he wanted to hurt me." Joseph filed away the descriptions while focusing on keeping Anna calm. But privately, he was troubled by the level of detail she remembered. Most children her age would have fragmented memories of traumatic events, but Anna's recollections were precise and consistent. Either she had an unusually good memory, or the events had been so shocking that every detail had burned itself into her consciousness. Over the next few days, they established new routines that helped both of them sleep better. Joseph taught Anna basic Apache words while she helped him with daily tasks. Their conversations a mix of languages that felt natural in the isolated cabin. She learned to say water and fire and safe in Apache, while he practiced English, phrases that sounded more formal than his usual frontier dialect. It was during one of these language lessons that Anna made a revelation that changed everything. They were preparing vegetables for stew when she paused in her work, staring at the small knife Joseph had given her for cutting carrots. Papa wasn't just angry about land, she said quietly. He was scared. He told Mama that he'd found something bad, something that could put important people in jail. He said we might have to leave Denver and go somewhere safe until he could tell the right people what he knew. Joseph set down his own knife, giving Anna his full attention. Do you remember what he found? What made him so scared? Papers. Lots of papers with names and numbers. He kept them in a special box in his study, the one with the good lock. Mama said Papa was a lawyer, and sometimes lawyers had to keep dangerous secrets safe until the right time. The pieces clicked into place with startling clarity. Anna's father had been a lawyer who discovered evidence of corruption involving land deals. The bad men had come to silence him before he could expose whatever illegal activity he'd uncovered. When killing him hadn't been enough to ensure their safety, they'd hired someone to eliminate his daughter as well, the only witness who might remember enough to cause problems later. But Anna's Uncle Robert had lost his nerve at the crucial moment. Instead of following through with whatever he'd been paid to do, he'd abandoned her in the wilderness and disappeared, probably hoping that exposure would do the job for him while keeping his hands technically clean. The realization filled Joseph with cold rage. These weren't random criminals or desperate men acting in the heat of passion. This was a calculated conspiracy involving people with enough money and influence to hire assassins and cover their tracks. Anna wasn't just an orphan, she was a threat to powerful interests that had already killed to protect their secrets. That afternoon, while Anna napped by the fire, Joseph made preparations that drew on 30 years of military and scouting experience. He cleaned and loaded his rifles, checked his ammunition supplies, and began planning escape routes from the cabin. If trouble came looking for them, he intended to be ready. He also began teaching Anna skills she would need to survive if something happened to him. Under the guise of games and activities, he showed her how to move quietly through the forest, how to find edible plants, how to signal for help using smoke and mirrors. She approached these lessons with the same serious attention she gave to everything else, perhaps sensing that they were more than entertainment. "Why are you teaching me these things, Papa Joe?" she asked one evening after a particularly thorough lesson in forest navigation. The name she'd started using, Papa Joe, hit him harder than expected every time. It spoke to a trust and affection that he hadn't experienced since Maya's death, and it made him more determined than ever to keep her safe. "Because strong people know how to take care of themselves," he replied. "Your real Papa wanted you to be strong and smart." These skills honor his memory. Anna nodded solemnly, accepting the explanation without further questions. But that night, as she slept peacefully for the first time since the nightmares began, Joseph kept watch at the window, studying the tree line for signs of movement that didn't belong. The blood-stained handkerchief with its embroidered RH lay on the table beside Anna's bed, a reminder that her Uncle Robert, whoever he really was, had carried evidence of violence when he abandoned her. Whether that blood belonged to Anna's parents or someone else, it represented a connection to the conspiracy that had torn apart her family. Joseph had spent years trying to forget the guilt that came with failing to protect his daughter. Now, faced with a second chance to save a child who needed him, he felt those old skills and instincts awakening. The man who'd once been one of the Army's most effective scouts was emerging from 20 years of self-imposed exile. And this time, he wouldn't let innocent blood be spilled on his watch. Outside, snow continued to fall, covering their tracks and providing natural camouflage for the cabin. But winter wouldn't last forever, and when spring came, the men responsible for Anna's suffering would learn that some debts could only be paid in full. The burned letter changed everything. Joseph found it on his second visit to the abandoned Ross mansion, a sprawling house that sat on the hill overlooking Cedar Ridge like a monument to wealth and ambition. Hamilton Ross had been the town's most prominent citizen banker, land speculator, and political influence who'd built his fortune on territorial expansion and federal contracts. 3 weeks ago, the Ross family had supposedly left for California on urgent business, leaving their grand home empty and their affairs in the hands of distant attorneys. But the hastily packed belongings and charred documents in the fireplace told a different story. Someone had left in a hurry, burning papers that might have provided inconvenient evidence of questionable business practices. Most of the documents had been destroyed too thoroughly to read, but one partially burned letter had fallen behind. The grate where flames hadn't reached. The fragment that remained was written in a careful hand. The arrangement must be honored. The girl knows too much, and her father's investigation was getting too close to our operations. Payment as discussed will be delivered upon confirmation that both problems have been permanently resolved. Destroy this correspondence immediately. After, the letter was signed with the initials, R.H., the same initials embroidered on the blood-stained handkerchief Anna carried. Uncle Robert hadn't been a reluctant participant in Anna's kidnapping. He'd been a paid assassin working for Hamilton Ross, and whoever else was involved in the conspiracy. Joseph studied the letter fragment with growing anger. The casual way it discussed murdering a child. Both problems have been permanently resolved. Spoke to a level of callousness that made his skin crawl. These men had ordered the deaths of Anna's parents and then paid to have her killed as well, all to protect some illegal land operation that apparently generated enough money to justify multiple murders. Anna was sitting by the fire when Joseph returned to the cabin, working on a drawing with the colored pencils he'd bought her in town. She'd become more talkative over the past 2 weeks, sharing memories of her life in Denver and asking questions about his own past. The bond between them had deepened into something that felt remarkably like the father-daughter relationship he'd lost 20 years earlier. "Papa Joe," she said without looking up from her drawing, "why do some people hurt children?" The question caught him off guard, though he probably should have expected it. Anna was too intelligent to avoid thinking about what had happened to her, and too observant not to notice the precautions he'd been taking around the cabin. Joseph sat down beside her, studying the drawing she'd been working on. It showed 2 figures, a tall man and a small girl, standing in front of a cabin surrounded by snow-covered trees. The detail was remarkable for a child her age, down to the icicles hanging from the roof and the smoke rising from the chimney. "I don't know why some people choose to hurt others," he said honestly. "Maybe they're scared, or angry, or they want something they can't have honestly. But that doesn't make it right, and it doesn't mean good people shouldn't fight back." "Are you going to fight the bad men who hurt my parents?" Joseph chose his words carefully. "I'm going to make sure you're safe, Anna, and I'm going to find out the truth about what happened to your family. Sometimes that means fighting, and sometimes it means being smart and patient." She nodded solemnly, adding careful shading to the trees in her drawing. "In my dreams, I remember more things about that night. Not just the bad men, but other things. Papa had visitors earlier that day. Nice men in suits who said they were from the government. They talked about helping Papa with his investigation. Do you remember what they looked like? One was tall with gray hair and a mustache. The other was younger, with brown hair and spectacles. They seemed nice, and Papa seemed relieved to see them. But then the bad men came that night, and everything went wrong. Joseph filed away the descriptions, wondering if Anna's father had been working with federal authorities when he'd been killed. If so, there might be people in Denver or Washington who were still interested in the investigation that had cost 2 lives and nearly claimed a third. That evening, after Anna had gone to sleep, Joseph sat at his desk and began composing a letter that drew on contacts he'd made during his military service. Colonel Marcus Webb had been his commanding officer during the Apache campaigns, a career soldier who'd since moved to Washington and now worked in the Bureau of Indian Affairs. If anyone could discreetly investigate federal involvement in Anna's father's case, it would be Webb. Joseph wrote carefully, providing enough detail to convey the urgency of the situation without putting Anna at risk if the letter fell into the wrong hands. He described finding a lost child whose parents had been involved in a land dispute, mentioned evidence of corruption involving territorial officials, and requested any information about federal investigations that might be relevant. He signed it with the old code name Webb would recognize: Nalnish, the name his Apache mother had given him. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor. Joseph was teaching Anna how to track animals in the snow when he heard the approach of a single horse moving at a casual pace. Through the trees, he could see an elderly Apache woman riding a paint mar, her gray hair braided with ribbons and her weathered face familiar despite the years that had passed. Grandmother Ayana, Joseph called out in Apache, using the respectful title for an elder of his mother's clan. Ayana dismounted with the practiced ease of someone who'd been riding longer than most people had been alive. She was probably 70 years old, but her eyes were sharp and her movements sure as she approached the cabin. "Nalnish," she replied, studying his face with the directness that Apache elders used when they had important things to say. "I heard you found a lost child. News travels fast in the mountains. Everything travels fast when people are talking about things they shouldn't." Ayana's gaze found Anna, who had moved to stand beside Joseph with the instinctive wariness of a child who'd learned not to trust strangers. "This is the girl who was left to die?" "This is Anna," Joseph said. "Anna, this is grandmother Ayana. She's family." Anna performed a careful curtsy, the kind of formal greeting she'd been taught for meeting important adults. Ayana's expression softened as she returned the courtesy with a slight bow. "She has your daughter's eyes," Ayana said quietly in Apache. The observation hit Joseph like a physical blow. He'd noticed the resemblance himself, but had tried not to dwell on it, afraid that his growing attachment to Anna was based more on grief than genuine affection. But hearing it from someone who'd known Maya made it impossible to ignore. "Maya would have been 28 this year," Ayana continued. "A woman grown, probably with children of her own. But she lives on in your heart, just as she lives in the stories we tell about her courage. I failed to protect her. You were protecting other children that day. The raid you stopped saved a dozen families, including children younger than Maya. She would have understood that sacrifice." Anna looked between them, following the conversation despite the language barrier. "Are you talking about someone who died?" she asked. Joseph knelt to her level. "My daughter. She died a long time ago, when she was not much older than you are now." "I'm sorry she died," Anna said with the simple sincerity that only children could manage. "But I'm glad you found me. Maybe she helped you find me." The words carried more wisdom than their speaker probably understood. Whether through coincidence, fate, or the intervention of spirits, Joseph had been given a second chance to protect a child who needed him. This time, he wouldn't let his duties to others prevent him from fulfilling his responsibility to the person who mattered most. Ayana stayed for dinner, sharing news from the reservation and stories that made Anna laugh, despite not understanding all the Apache phrases. As the old woman prepared to leave, she pulled Joseph aside. "There are men asking questions about you in town," she said quietly. "White men with money and hard faces. They want to know about your past, your skills, whether you have family, or people who would miss you. Joseph felt his blood cool. How many men? 3 that I saw, maybe more. They're being careful, asking indirect questions, but they're definitely hunting someone. Diana's eyes found Anna through the window. Be very careful, Nalnish. The child needs you to be smart more than she needs you to be brave. As Ayana rode away into the gathering darkness, Joseph began making preparations for the possibility that their safe refuge was about to become a battleground. The music box played For Elise in delicate, crystalline notes that seemed to hang in the dusty air of the abandoned Ross mansion. Joseph had returned to search more thoroughly, and Anna had insisted on coming with him despite his reservations about her safety. Now, as the familiar melody filled the silence, he watched years of fear drain from her face like water from a broken dam. I remember this song, Anna whispered, reaching toward the small wooden box with trembling fingers. Mama used to play it for me every night before bed. She said it would keep the nightmares away. The music box was exquisite hand-carved rosewood, with brass fittings, the kind of luxury item that cost more than most frontier families earned in a year. Inside the lid was an engraved plate, for Anna Catherine, with love from Uncle Hamilton and Aunt Margaret Ross. Joseph felt pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The Ross family hadn't been strangers who'd left town suddenly. They'd been Anna's relatives, people she should have been able to trust, people who should have protected her when her parents died. Instead, they'd orchestrated her kidnapping and attempted murder to protect their own criminal enterprises. Uncle Hamilton was Mama's brother, Anna said, her voice distant with recovered memory. He came to visit us in Denver sometimes. He always brought me presents and told funny stories. Mama said he loved me like his own daughter. The betrayal was complete and devastating. Hamilton Ross hadn't just ordered the death of his own niece. He'd done it while maintaining the pretense of being a loving uncle. The casual cruelty of it made Joseph's hands clench into fists. Anna was exploring the music box more carefully now, her small fingers finding a hidden catch that opened a secret compartment. Inside was a folded piece of paper covered with her father's handwriting notes about land transactions, names of territorial officials, dates and dollar amounts that painted a picture of systematic corruption. Papa hid this here when we visited last summer, Anna said with growing excitement. He told me it was our special secret, that if anything ever happened to him, I should remember where he put the important papers. Joseph unfolded the document, scanning its contents with growing understanding. Anna's father had been investigating a conspiracy to defraud the federal government of reservation lands designated for Apache tribes. Hamilton Ross and his associates had been falsifying surveys, bribing territorial officials, and selling protected lands to railroad companies and mining interests. The scheme had generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegal profits while displacing Native American families who'd been promised permanent homes. The names on the list read like a who's who of territorial politics and business. Senators, judges, railroad executives, and army contractors. Anna's father had uncovered evidence that could have sent dozens of powerful men to prison and returned stolen lands to their rightful owners. No wonder they'd been willing to commit murder to keep their secrets safe. Papa was trying to help the Apache people, Anna said, reading over Joseph's shoulder. He said it wasn't fair that they were being cheated out of their homes. Joseph felt a complex mix of emotions: grief for Anna's murdered parents, rage at the men who'd betrayed both Anna and his own people, and something approaching hope that justice might finally be possible. Anna's father had died trying to protect Apache lands, and now Joseph had the evidence to continue that fight. Your father was a good man, Joseph said quietly. He died trying to do the right thing, and Uncle Hamilton killed him for it. The simple statement carried devastating weight. Anna had remembered not just the music box and the hidden papers, but the full scope of her family's betrayal. At 8 years old, she understood that people she'd loved and trusted had murdered her parents and tried to kill her. To protect money that had been stolen from Joseph's people, they spent the rest of the day carefully searching the mansion, finding more hidden documents and evidence of hasty departure. In Hamilton Ross's study, Joseph discovered correspondence with railroad executives discussing clearing obstacles to land acquisition. In Margaret Ross's bedroom, Anna found jewelry and family photographs that had been left behind in the rush to escape. They were scared, Anna observed with the analytical mind that reminded Joseph of her lawyer father. They pack clothes and money but left behind things that mattered to them. That means they're planning to come back when they think it's safe. Joseph nodded, impressed by her reasoning. Or they're planning to send someone else to clean up. Loose ends. That evening, back at the cabin, they organized the evidence they'd collected. The hidden papers from the music box provided names, dates, and financial details that could support federal prosecution. The burned letter fragment proved Hamilton Ross's involvement in ordering Anna's death. Combined with Anna's eyewitness testimony about the night her parents were killed, they had enough evidence to destroy the entire conspiracy. But evidence was only valuable if they could deliver it to the right people without being killed in the process. Joseph's letter to Colonel Webb was still making its way through military channels, and they had no way of knowing who else might be involved in the corruption. For all they knew, territorial law enforcement was compromised as well as they worked. By lamplight, Anna began having flashes of additional memories triggered by the documents they'd found. She remembered conversations between her parents about threats and bribes, meetings with federal investigators who'd promised protection, and her father's growing fear that their family was in danger. There was another man, Anna said suddenly, looking up from a photograph of railroad executives. He came to our house the night Papa hid the papers. He wasn't one of the bad men who came later. This one was different. He wore a badge and said he was going to help Papa testify against the land thieves. Do you remember his name? Marshall Williams, I think. He was tall and serious, but he was kind to me. He said Papa was very brave for trying to help the Apache people. Anna's expression grew troubled. But if Marshall Williams was helping Papa, why didn't he stop the bad men from hurting us? Joseph had wondered the same thing. If federal marshals had been investigating the land fraud, they should have been able to provide protection for key witnesses. The fact that Anna's parents had been killed suggested either incompetence or corruption at the highest levels. That night, as Anna slept peacefully with the music box beside her bed, Joseph kept watch at the window while planning their next moves. The evidence they'd gathered was valuable, but it also made them incredibly dangerous to the men who'd killed for their secrets. Every hour they remained in Cedar Ridge increased the risk that Hamilton Ross's associates would track them down. Joseph had survived 30 years on the frontier by being prepared for trouble, but this was different. He wasn't just responsible for his own safety. He had a child to protect, a child who represented both justice for murdered parents and hope for his own redemption. The men hunting them had already proven their willingness to kill innocents, and they had the resources to hire professional killers who wouldn't hesitate the way Uncle Robert had. But Joseph also had advantages they might not expect. He knew the mountains better than anyone. He had all eyes among the Apache communities who would help protect Anna, and he had skills honed by decades of warfare and survival. Most importantly, he had something worth fighting for, a daughter he'd been given a second chance to save. Tomorrow, he would begin putting plans in motion that would either bring justice for Anna's family or result in his own death. Either way, the men who'd stolen Apache lands and murdered honest people would learn that some debts could only be paid in blood. The federal marshal's badge was tarnished with age and hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Joseph's cabin, wrapped in oiled leather alongside documents that completely reframed everything Anna thought she knew about the man who'd saved her life. Marshall Williams had indeed been investigating the land fraud conspiracy because Marshall Williams and Joseph Crowfeather were the same person. Anna discovered the truth by accident while helping Joseph pack supplies for what he told her would be a temporary move to a safer location. She'd been gathering blankets from the storage chest when her foot had caught on an uneven floorboard, revealing the hidden compartment beneath. Her small hands had pulled out the leather bundle with innocent curiosity, unwrapping it to find the badge and documents that shattered her understanding of the past 2 months. "Papa Joe," she said quietly, holding up the badge with its distinctive eagle and scales of justice. "What is this?" Joseph froze in his preparations, recognizing the moment he'd been dreading since the day he'd found her in the snow. The careful fiction he'd maintained, the exile, the solitary life. The man who'd simply stumbled upon a lost child, crumbled in the face of an 8-year-old's direct question. "That's my real job," he said simply, setting down the rifle he'd been cleaning to give her his full attention. "But you're not Joseph Crowfeather, the outcast scout." "I am Joseph Crowfeather, but I'm also United States Marshal Thomas Williams. And I've been working undercover for 3 years to investigate the land fraud that killed your parents." Anna stared at the badge, then at Joseph, her intelligent eyes processing implications that would have challenged adult minds. "You knew who I was when you found me." "No," Joseph said firmly, kneeling to her level. "When I found you in the snow, you were just a lost child who needed help. I didn't know your identity until you showed me the locket, and I didn't understand the full connection until we found your father's papers. But you knew about the bad men stealing Apache land." "Yes, that's what I was sent here to investigate." "Your father was helping me gather evidence, along with other federal investigators. We were building a case that would have sent Hamilton Ross and his associates to prison for decades." Anna was quiet for a long moment, turning the badge over in her small hands. When she looked up, her eyes were bright with tears that could have been relief or betrayal or simple confusion. "Were you lying when you said you lost your daughter?" "No, Anna, that was true. Everything I told you about Maya, about my guilt over failing to protect her, all of that was real. The undercover assignment was my job, but you became something much more important." Joseph reached into the leather bundle and pulled out a telegram from his commanding officer, dated 3 weeks earlier. "This is an order recalling me to Washington. My superiors want me to abandon the investigation and report for reassignment. They think the case is too dangerous to continue." "Why didn't you go?" "Because I found you. Because you needed protection, and because your father's evidence gave me the chance to finish what we started." Joseph's voice carried the weight of a decision that had changed both their lives. "I chose to disobey orders and risk my career to keep you safe." Anna studied the documents with the same careful attention she'd given to everything else since her rescue. Federal correspondence, intelligence reports, maps of fraudulent land transactions. The paper trail of a complex investigation that had cost lives and would likely cost more before it ended. "The night Papa hid the papers in Uncle Hamilton's music box," Anna said slowly. "He was meeting with you, wasn't he?" "You were the marshal who came to our house." Joseph nodded. "Your father was incredibly brave, Anna. He knew he was risking his life to help my people reclaim their stolen lands, but he insisted on doing the right thing anyway. And when the bad men killed him, they thought they were stopping the investigation. They were wrong. Your father had already given me copies of the most important documents, and he told me about additional evidence hidden in your uncle's house. What they didn't expect was for you to survive and remember where the remaining papers were hidden. The full scope of the conspiracy was becoming clear to Anna with the frightening intelligence she displayed since her rescue. So Uncle Hamilton didn't just want me dead because I saw the bad men. He wanted me dead because I could lead investigators to propose evidence. Exactly. You weren't just a witness, you were the key to destroying their entire operation." Anna was quiet for several minutes, processing revelations that would have overwhelmed most adults. Finally, she looked up with an expression that reminded Joseph powerfully of her father's determined face in their last meeting. "What happens now, Papa Joe?" The question carried layers of meaning. She was asking about immediate safety, about long-term plans, about whether the man she'd come to love as a father was going to disappear back into his official duties. Joseph felt the weight of decisions that would determine not just their survival, but the shape of whatever relationship they might have going forward. "Now we finish what your father started," Joseph said. "We use the evidence we've gathered to destroy the men who killed your parents and stole Apache lands. But Anna," he paused, choosing his words carefully, "after this is over, after the trials and the testimony, I don't know what will happen to us." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I disobeyed orders to protect you. I might lose my job, my badge, everything I've worked for in federal law enforcement. And you'll need a permanent home, a real family, people who can give you the life you deserve." Anna's response was immediate and fierce. "You are my real family. You're the one who saved me, who took care of me, who taught me Apache words, and helped me remember good things about Mama and Papa. I don't want anyone else." Joseph felt his throat tighten with emotions he'd kept buried for 20 years. "Anna, I'm an old man who spent most of his life living alone. I need you," she interrupted with the absolute certainty that only children possessed. "You need me too. We saved each other, Papa Joe. That makes us family, no matter what any government papers say." The simple truth of her words hit Joseph harder than any revelation in the hidden documents. She was right. They'd saved each other. He'd found purpose in protecting her, while she'd found safety in trusting him. The love between them wasn't based on blood or legal documents, but on choice and commitment and the kind of bond that formed when two people faced danger together. "All right," Joseph said, pulling her into the kind of hug he'd never thought he'd give again. "We'll face whatever comes next together. But first, we have to survive long enough to see justice done." Anna nodded against his chest, then pulled back with renewed determination. "What do we need to do?" Joseph looked at the evidence spread across his table, the badge that represented his official authority, and the child who'd become more important than any career or duty. The men who'd killed her parents were closing in, probably aware by now that their plan to eliminate all witnesses had failed. Within days, maybe hours, professional killers would come for both of them. But Joseph had spent 3 years preparing for this moment, building relationships with federal agents who could be trusted, gathering evidence that would survive even if he didn't, creating backup plans that would ensure justice even if it cost him everything. "We're going to send a message to people in Washington who can help us," Joseph said. "Then we're going to make sure you're safe while I deal with the men who think they can murder children and steal from my people." "Together," Anna said firmly. "Together." Joseph agreed, meaning it more than any oath he'd ever sworn as a federal marshal. Outside, snow continued to fall, but inside the cabin, two people who'd found family in each other began planning for a confrontation that would either destroy them or set them free. The ceremonial Apache feather had belonged to Joseph's father, a war chief who'd fought beside Geronimo in the final campaigns against the army. Now, as Joseph carefully braided it into Anna's dark hair, he whispered the protection prayers his mother had taught him 40 years earlier. The ritual carried weight beyond superstition. It was a declaration that this child belonged to his clan, his people, his heart. "What are you saying?" Anna asked quietly, holding perfectly still while Joseph's weathered fingers worked the sacred feather into place. "I'm asking the spirits of my ancestors to protect you," Joseph replied in Apache, then translated. "I'm telling them you're my daughter now, that you deserve their blessing and protection." Anna reached up to touch the feather with reverent fingers. "Will it keep me safe? The feather is just a symbol. What keeps you safe is your courage, your intelligence, and the preparation we've made together. Over the past week since discovering Joseph's true identity as Marshall Williams, they had transformed from refugees into active participants in their own survival. The evidence Anna's father had gathered was now safely copied and hidden in multiple locations, with sets of documents already delivered to federal agents in Denver and Santa Fe. More importantly, Anna had memorized the locations of every hiding place, every escape route, every emergency cache that Joseph had prepared during his 3 years undercover. The cabin had been turned into a fortress that would have impressed Joseph's old military commanders. Windows were reinforced and positioned to provide overlapping fields of fire. Hidden compartments contained weapons, ammunition, and supplies that could sustain them through a prolonged siege. Emergency escape tunnels led to concealed positions in the surrounding forest where they could disappear if the main position became untenable. But Joseph's greatest advantage wasn't military preparation. It was the network of allies he'd quietly cultivated among the Apache communities. Grandmother Ayana had carried word to warriors who remembered Joseph's efforts to protect their lands, and those men now watched the approaches to his cabin with the patient skill of people who'd been fighting for their survival for generations. Anna had proven herself an apt student of both warfare and survival. She could load rifles with the quick efficiency of a frontier veteran, navigate by stars and landmarks with the confidence of someone who'd grown up in the wilderness, and most importantly, she could remain calm under pressure while following complex instructions without hesitation. "Remember," Joseph said as he finished braiding the feather into her hair, "if shooting starts, you go immediately to the tunnel entrance behind the wood stove. Don't wait for me. Don't look back. Don't try to help. Your job is to reach the safety cache and stay hidden until one of our Apache friends finds you. And if something happens to you?" Joseph had dreaded this conversation, but Anna deserved honest answers. "If I don't make it out, you follow the plan we practiced. You go to Grandmother Ayana's camp, and should get you to the federal agents in Santa Fe. You tell them everything you remember. You give them the evidence locations we memorized, and you let them finish what your father started. I won't leave. You behind Papa Joe." "Anna." Joseph's voice carried the authority of a federal marshal and the love of a father. "The most important thing you can do for me is survive. If these men kill both of us, your parents' murder goes unpunished and the land thieves win. I can't let that happen." Anna nodded reluctantly, understanding the logic even as she hated the necessity. At 8 years old, she'd already learned lessons about loss and survival that most people never faced in a lifetime. Their preparations were interrupted by a signal. From the forest, the call of a canyon wren that was slightly off-key. A sound that meant Apache scouts had spotted approaching riders. Joseph had been expecting this moment for days, ever since his sources in town reported that Hamilton Ross had returned to Cedar Ridge with professional gunmen and a determination to eliminate all witnesses to his crimes. "How many?" Joseph called, softly in Apache, knowing the sound would carry to his allies. The return signal indicated 5 riders approaching from the main trail, moving at a steady pace that suggested confidence rather than caution. Professional killers, then. Men who expected this confrontation to be brief and decisive. Anna had moved to her assigned position near the tunnel entrance without being told, but her eyes remained fixed on Joseph with the kind of trust that made him more determined than ever to prove worthy of her faith. She looked impossibly small with the war feather in her hair, but there was steel in her spine that reminded him of Apache women who defended their children against impossible odds. "Anna," Joseph said quietly, "whatever happens in the next few hours, I want you to know that finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You gave me back my daughter's memory and my own sense of purpose." "You saved me first," Anna replied with simple dignity. Everything else just followed from that. Joseph nodded, then turned his attention to final preparations. His rifles were loaded and positioned at windows that commanded different approaches. to the cabin. His revolver sat in its holster, clean and ready. More importantly, his mind was clear and focused with the kind of calm that had made him effective during 30 years of dangerous assignments. Through the window, he could see the riders emerging from the tree line, 5 men on good horses, armed with military precision, moving with the coordination of people who'd worked together before. Hamilton Ross was among them, recognizable despite the distance by his expensive clothes and the arrogant way he sat his horse. The others were harder types, men whose faces carried the weathered indifference of professional violence. Joseph felt familiar sensations washing over him. The heightened awareness, the slowing of time, the crystalline clarity that came when survival depended on split-second decisions. He'd experienced this state of mind in Apache raids, cavalry charges, and federal operations that never appeared in official reports. It was the feeling of a predator preparing to defend territory that mattered more than life itself. "They're stopping," Anna observed from her position. The riders had halted just beyond rifle range, probably discussing strategy and trying to determine the best approach to the cabin. Joseph used the delay to make final checks of his weapons and review the tactical situation. 5 against 1 wasn't impossible odds for someone with his experience and advantages, but success would depend on using every tool at his disposal. The Apache feather in Anna's hair caught the light from the window, reminding Joseph of similar feathers his daughter Maya had worn during tribal ceremonies. The memory strengthened his resolve rather than weakening it this time. He wouldn't fail to protect the child who trusted him with her life. Hamilton Ross dismounted and began walking toward the cabin with a white cloth tied to a rifle barrel, the universal symbol for parley. Joseph watched him approach with grim satisfaction, recognizing the businessman's attempt to negotiate as evidence that Ross understood the strength of his position. Men who were confident of victory didn't usually bother with conversation before killing. "Marshal Williams," Ross called when he'd reached speaking distance. "I believe we need to discuss terms." Joseph appeared at the window, rifle visible but not immediately threatening. "The only terms I'm interested in involve you surrendering to federal custody, Ross. I think you misunderstand the situation, Marshal. You're outnumbered, isolated, and in possession of property that doesn't belong to you." "You mean Anna?" "She's not property, Ross. She's your niece, a child you tried to murder to protect your illegal profits." Ross's facade of civilization slipped slightly. "The girl is a threat to legitimate business interests. Her father was a troublemaker who didn't understand the realities of territorial development. Her father was an honest lawyer trying to protect Apache treaty rights. You had him killed because he discovered your land fraud conspiracy. Business decisions sometimes require difficult choices," Ross replied with the casual cruelty that had characterized all his dealings with human life. "I'm prepared to offer you substantial compensation for walking away from this investigation. Enough money to disappear and live comfortably for the rest of your life." Joseph studied the man who'd ordered the death of his own niece, seeing not a successful businessman, but a predator whose mask had finally slipped completely away. And Anna, the girl, unfortunately witnessed events that make her continued existence problematic for several important people. "I'm sure you understand." "I understand perfectly," Joseph replied, raising his rifle to a more threatening position. "I understand that you're planning to murder a child to protect money stolen from my people. I understand that you think I'll sell out an innocent girl for your blood money. I understand that you're about to discover just how wrong you can be." Ross stepped back, his pretense of negotiation abandoned. "You're making a mistake, Marshal. There are forces involved in this matter that you can't possibly fight." "Maybe, but I'm willing to try." As Ross retreated toward his men, Joseph felt the familiar calm of inevitable violence settling over him. The talking was finished, the positions were clear, and the confrontation that had been building for months was finally at hand. Anna watched from her position, near the escape tunnel, the Apache feather in her hair catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. In her face, Joseph could see the same determined courage that had carried her through everything from her parents' murder to weeks of survival in hostile wilderness. Whatever happened in the next few hours, she would know that someone had fought for her with everything he had. And if the spirits of his ancestors were listening, maybe that would be enough to see her safely through to the other side of this darkness. Dawn brought death to the mountain, carried on the boots of men who'd mistaken an aging Apache scout for easy prey. Joseph Crowfeather woke to the soft whistle that meant Apache watchers had spotted Hamilton Ross and his hired killers moving into position around the cabin. The sound came from 3 directions. Confirming what Joseph had expected, they were surrounded. Anna was already awake, sitting quietly by the escape tunnel with his father's hunting knife strapped to her small waist. The blade had been in his family for 3 generations, carried by warriors who'd fought against Mexican soldiers, American cavalry, and anyone else who'd threatened Apache lands. Now, it rested against the hip of an 8-year-old girl who'd become more precious to him than his own life. How many? Anna whispered in the mixture of English and Apache they developed during their weeks together. More than yesterday, Joseph replied, checking his rifle while studying the tree line through reinforced windows. Ross brought additional men during the night, professional gunfighters by the look of them. The cabin felt different in the pre-dawn darkness, smaller, more vulnerable, like a fortress that had suddenly become a trap. But Joseph had chosen this ground carefully, and the approaching killers would learn that some traps worked in both directions. Hamilton Ross appeared at the edge of the clearing, no longer bothering with flags of truce or pretenses of negotiation. His expensive clothes were rumpled from sleeping rough, and his face carried the haggard look of a man who'd discovered that money couldn't solve every problem. Behind him, professional killers spread out with military precision, taking positions that would allow crossfire into the cabin from multiple angles. "Marshal Williams," Ross called out, his voice carrying the brutal confidence of someone trying to convince himself of his own power. "This is your final opportunity to surrender. Walk out unarmed with the girl, and I'll make your deaths quick." Joseph's response was the sound of his rifle being cocked, a noise that carried clearly across the mountain stillness. Ross flinched at the metallic click, perhaps finally understanding that he was dealing with a man who'd spent 30 years surviving situations where surrender meant death. The first shot came from Ross's left flank, a professional killer named Carson, who'd made the mistake of assuming an Apache scout would fight like a white man. Joseph had been tracking Carson's movement through peripheral vision, and when the gunman raised his rifle, Joseph was already in motion. The bullet splintered wood where Joseph's head had been a heartbeat earlier, while Joseph's return shot took Carson in the chest and dropped him among the pine needles with the finality of a falling tree. The sound echoed off the mountain peaks like thunder, announcing that the battle for Anna's life had finally begun. "Go!" Joseph shouted to Anna as more shots erupted from the surrounding forest. "Tunnel, now!" Anna disappeared into the hidden entrance behind the wood stove without argument or hesitation, trusting Joseph to follow the plan they'd rehearsed until it was automatic. Joseph heard her moving through the carefully concealed passage that would take her to safety and felt a weight lift from his shoulders. Whatever happened next, she was moving toward survival rather than destruction. A bullet shattered the window beside Joseph's position, sending glass fragments across the cabin floor. Like deadly rain, the shooter had revealed his position, and Joseph's return fire was immediate and precise. Another of Ross's hired killers screamed and fell, his rifle tumbling into the underbrush as he clutched a shattered shoulder. The hunting knife that had belonged to Joseph's father seemed to pulse with ancestral power as it disappeared with Anna into the tunnel system. 3 generations of Apache warriors had carried that blade in defense of family and homeland, and now it would protect the child who'd become part of their legacy. Through choice rather than blood, Joseph rolled to a new firing position as bullets punched through the cabin walls, sending splinters of wood flying through air that tasted of gunpowder and determination. These weren't the random shots of frightened amateurs. Ross had hired men who understood their business and wouldn't be easily discouraged by casualties. But Joseph understood his business too. He'd fought Apache raiders who could appear and disappear like ghosts, Mexican bandits who showed no mercy to prisoners, and army deserters who'd learned killing in the same schools he had. Hamilton Ross's hired guns were dangerous, but they weren't supernatural. The battle that would determine Anna's future and settle accounts for her murdered parents had begun in earnest. The girl's drawing of her new family, two figures standing together against the world, lay clutched in Anna's small hands as she huddled in the safety cache, listening to gunfire that would determine whether she'd grow up an orphan or a daughter. The crude crayon picture showed her and Papa Joe in front of their cabin, surrounded by mountains that had become home in ways her privileged life in Denver never had. Through the carefully concealed ventilation shaft, Anna could hear the battle raging around the cabin she'd learned to call home. Papa Joe's rifle spoke in measured cadences, aimed shots from a man who'd learned to make every bullet count. The answering fire from Ross's men was more frantic, the rapid shooting of people trying to overwhelm precision with volume. Anna forced herself to remain still despite every instinct screaming at her to help the man who'd saved her life. Papa Joe had been explicit about her role: survive, remember, and testify when the shooting stopped. The evidence, locations, the names of corrupt officials, the details of her parents' murder, all of it depended on her living through the next hour. But staying hidden while Papa Joe fought alone felt like the worst kind of cowardice. The sound of splintering wood echoed through the forest as one of Ross's men tried to break down the cabin's reinforced door. Anna heard Papa Joe's war cry, a sound that belonged to Apache battlefields and carried the fury of a man defending his child. The attempt to breach the door ended in a scream that suggested the attacker had discovered just how prepared their target really was. "Where's the girl?" Hamilton Ross's voice carried clearly through the mountain air, pitched high with desperation and rage. "Find the girl. She's the real target." Anna pressed herself deeper into the hidden cache, grateful for Papa Joe's foresight in preparing multiple escape routes. The space was cramped but comfortable, stocked with supplies that could sustain her for days if necessary. More importantly, it was invisible from outside, camouflaged with techniques Papa Joe had learned during his years as a military scout. A new sound joined the battle, the distinctive whistle of Apache warriors moving through forest. Papa Joe's allies were closing in, turning Ross's ambush into a trap of his own. The hired gunman who'd expected to overwhelm one aging scout now faced fighters who'd learned warfare from Geronimo himself. Through the ventilation shaft, Anna could hear Hamilton Ross shouting orders that his men were increasingly reluctant to follow. Professional killers were brave enough when facing victims, but Apache warriors were a different proposition entirely. These were men who'd survived decades of conflict by being faster, smarter, and more ruthless than their enemies. The gunfire was moving away from the cabin now, spreading through the forest as Ross's men found themselves hunted rather than hunting. Anna heard Papa Joe's voice calling instructions in Apache, coordinating with warriors who'd accepted her as clan daughter despite her white blood and Denver upbringing. A shadow passed across the cache entrance, too quick and quiet to be one of Ross's men. Anna held her breath until she heard the soft call that meant safety. "Little bird, it's time to fly home." Papa Joe's face appeared at the entrance, streaked with smoke and exhaustion, but alive and whole. Anna launched herself into his arms with the desperate relief of someone who'd feared she might never see him again. "Is it over?" Anna asked against his chest. "Ross and two of his men are dead," Papa Joe replied, his voice carrying the hollow tone of someone who'd survived another battle but taken no pleasure in the victory. The others ran when the Apache warriors arrived. "They won't be back." Anna pulled away to study his face, noting the new lines of fatigue and the way his hands shook slightly from adrenaline aftermath. "Are you hurt?" "Nothing that won't heal." But Anna, Papa Joe's expression grew serious. "This isn't really over. Ross was just one part of the conspiracy. There are others involved, powerful people who won't give up just because we've won one fight. What do we do now?" Papa Joe helped her gather the supplies from the cache, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to pack quickly during 30 years of dangerous assignments. "Now we take the evidence to federal authorities who can be trusted. We testify against the land thieves, and we make sure your parents' deaths weren't meaningless." As they emerged from the forest cache, Anna saw the full scope of the battle's aftermath. The cabin that had been their home showed bullet holes and scorch marks, but it was still standing. Around the clearing, Apache warriors were methodically searching bodies and collecting weapons with the practical thoroughness of people who'd learned to waste nothing. Hamilton Ross lay among the pine needles where Papa Joe's final shot had found him, his expensive clothes torn and bloodied, his face frozen in the surprise of someone who'd never expected consequences for his actions. The man who'd ordered the death of his own niece had discovered that some debts could only be paid with interest. Anna felt no satisfaction at her uncle's death, only a hollow sadness for the family that might have been. But she also felt something else, a sense of justice for her murdered parents and hope for the future she and Papa Joe would build together. They were family now, forged by choice and hardship rather than blood and law. Whatever came next, they would face it together. 6 months later, the adoption papers lay spread across the kitchen table of their rebuilt cabin like promises finally kept. Anna Catherine Crowfeather, her new legal name, a bridge between the family she'd lost and the one she'd found practiced. Writing her signature with the careful precision that characterized everything she did. The documents represented more than legal guardianship. They were proof that love could triumph over law, that chosen family could be stronger than blood relations, and that sometimes the most important rescues were mutual. Joseph watched his daughter work on her penmanship, still amazed by the quiet miracle of her presence in his life. The federal investigation that had followed Hamilton Ross's death had vindicated Anna's father completely, exposing a conspiracy that reached into territorial government, railroad boardrooms, and army contracting offices. 17 men had been indicted for land fraud, bribery, and conspiracy to commit murder. The stolen Apache lands were being returned to their rightful owners, and the legal precedent established by the case would protect tribal territories for decades to come. But the investigation's success felt less important than the simple fact that Anna was safe, healthy, and laughing at something she'd written in her notebook. "Papa Joe," Anna said, looking up from her writing practice, "Mrs. Patterson wants to know if you'll speak to her class about Apache history next week." Joseph smiled at the invitation. Elizabeth Patterson taught at Cedar Ridge's new school, a building that had been constructed with federal funds as part of the territorial reorganization that followed the land fraud scandal. Anna attended classes there 3 days a week, supplementing formal education with the Apache languages and survival skills that Joseph taught her at home. The town's attitude toward Joseph had transformed completely once his federal marshal credentials became public knowledge. The man they'd shunned as a dangerous half-breed outcast was now recognized as an undercover hero who'd risked everything to protect both Apache treaty rights and the life of an orphan child. Sheriff Donovan had quietly retired and moved to California, while other residents competed to demonstrate their friendship with the territory's most celebrated lawman. Joseph found the town's changed attitude more amusing than gratifying. He'd never needed their approval, and he didn't need their friendship now. What mattered was that Anna could attend school without facing prejudice, that she could grow up in a community that would nurture rather than limit her potential. "I'll speak to Mrs. Patterson's class," Joseph agreed. "What would you like me to tell them?" Anna considered the question with the seriousness she brought to all important matters. "Tell them about how Apache people take care of children who need families. Tell them that being adopted doesn't make someone less of a daughter." The simple request carried layers of meaning that spoke to Anna's ongoing process of understanding her place in the world. She grieved for her murdered parents while embracing her new life, honoring her birth family's memory while building traditions with her chosen family. The balance wasn't always easy, but she navigated it with remarkable grace for someone so young. Federal prosecutor James Morrison had visited twice during the past 6 months, ensuring that Anna's testimony would be preserved for future trials and checking on her welfare with genuine concern. Morrison had known Anna's father personally, and he'd made it clear that the federal government considered her a hero whose courage had made justice possible. "Your father would be incredibly proud of you," Morrison had said during his last visit. "Not just for your bravery during the investigation, but for the way you've built a new life while honoring his memory." Anna had accepted the praise with characteristic dignity, but Joseph knew she was still processing the trauma of everything she'd experienced. The nightmares came less frequently now, and when they did arrive, she no longer woke alone and frightened. Joseph was always there, ready with gentle words and the security of unconditional love. The music box that had belonged to Anna's birth family sat on the mantelpiece, its melody still able to bring tears to her eyes, but no longer triggering panic. She'd learned to separate the good memories from the traumatic ones, keeping the love while releasing the fear. "Papa Joe," Anna said, setting down her pen to study the adoption papers, "do you think Mama and Papa would be happy that I have a new father?" Joseph had dreaded this question, knowing it would come eventually. "Anna, your birth parents loved you more than life itself. They died trying to protect you and the Apache people from men who wanted to steal and hurt. I think they would be grateful that someone was able to keep you safe and give you the love you deserve. And Maya? Do you think she would like having a sister?" The question about his lost daughter hit Joseph with unexpected gentleness rather than pain. For 20 years, Maya's memory had been associated with guilt and failure. Now, through loving Anna, he'd been able to remember his daughter with joy and pride rather than only regret. "Maya would have adored you," Joseph said honestly. "She would have taught you Apache songs and shown you how to track animals and probably gotten both of you into more trouble than I could handle." Anna giggled at the image, then grew serious again. "I want to visit her grave sometime. I want to tell her thank you for helping you find me." Joseph felt tears threatening at the corners of his eyes. "We'll do that, Anna. We'll visit Maya together, and we'll tell her about our family." As evening approached, they prepared dinner together with the easy coordination of people who'd learned to work as a team. Anna set the table while Joseph cooked venison stew, both of them moving through routines that had become sacred through repetition. Outside, snow was beginning to fall, the first of the season, gentle and clean and beautiful rather than threatening. After dinner, Anna worked on her schoolwork, while Joseph wrote in the journal he'd started keeping to record their life together. Someday, when she was grown, she would read about these quiet evenings and understand how precious they'd been to a man who never expected to know such peace. The adoption papers made their relationship official, but the real bonds between them had been forged through choice, commitment, and the kind of love that emerges when two people save each other at the exact moment when rescue becomes possible. Joseph Crowfeather had found his daughter in the snow, but Anna Catherine Crowfeather had found her father in the same moment. Together, they'd built something that neither law nor blood could have created alone, a family chosen by the heart and sealed by the promise that some loves are strong enough to survive anything the world can inflict.